in the rain somewhere and got pretty wet. And like most people, the first reaction is like annoyance and this and that. But then we have to realize what a bracha rain is, particularly in Eretz Yisrael. We had a long season where there was very, very little rain. And when the rain finally comes, and Baruch Hashem today was a pretty heavy rain, it's really something to be very, very grateful for. That the fact that some people get wet a little bit, and part of that is their negligence, my negligence, in not carrying an umbrella. Don't blame God for that. I mean, HaKadosh Baruch Hu brought us a very big taiva. Remember one of the prayers, it's very fascinating, one of the tefillos of the Kohen Gadol, when he goes into the Kodesh HaKadoshim on Yom Kippur, is he davens that Hashem should not listen to the prayers of the travelers on the road who may pray that there shouldn't be rain. It's a tefillah, connected to what we talked about today. It's a tefillah that Hashem should not be makabel the tefillahs of the Ovrei Derachim, who would pray that there shouldn't be rain because they're traveling and they don't want to be in the mud and the like, right? So we see that the tefillah of the Ovrei Derachim was not considered a proper prayer, and that's why the Kohen Gadol prayed that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should not listen to it. This would be very relevant to what we talked about earlier today, that the Kayach of Yishmael is tefillah, but we could be mispalel that Hashem should not accept tefillahs that are offered for improper motivations. Okay. The other thing, without getting into politics, Trump apparently wants to take over Gaza and build golf courses and hotels and whatever it would be. Netanyahu seemed fine with that. Netanyahu didn't seem to object in any way. And once again, the world, you see the hand of Hashem all the time, both in the tragedies and in some of the good moments. And it just shows you that HaKadosh Baruch Hu controls the world. That you whatever you think is going to happen, there's always going to be a surprise down the road, one way or the other. And this is true in our individual lives too, and it's rather true in the terms of the destiny of Klal Yisrael and what's going on in the world. So there's a saying in Chinese. It's a curse in Chinese. May you live in interesting times. That's considered to be a curse because, and in a sense, Chazal say that the Chavlei Mashiach are going to be very, very difficult times. Difficult times in terms of wars, but also difficult times in terms of confusion. So it's going to be painful, indeed. In fact, one of the Amoraim actually said, he prays for Mashiach to come, and he prays that he won't be alive when Mashiach comes. He should have Techiyas HaMesim later, because the pre-Messianic events are going to be very, very, very difficult. And I think we see this with the ups and the downs. And although none of us, we're not allowed to talk about any specific date when Mashiach comes, it's actually usur to make any of those prognostications, although plenty of people like to do it here in Eretz Yisrael. But as a general sense that we're in the Chavlei Mashiach, this, and maybe we've been there since the Holocaust even, it could be a long period of time. But a general sense that we're in the Chavlei Mashiach, I think the Gedolei Yisrael have said. I mean, the Chafetz Chaim already said it so many, 70, 80, 90 years ago. So Chavlei Mashiach could be a very long pregnancy, so to speak, the pains of labor. And we're certainly in that period right now. So, B'Yesus Hashem, may we be zeichet to see the Geula Shlema B'Karv. So, little introduction. You have a question? Yeah.
Yeah, so if you're with someone and then you witness him stealing something, and then he goes and tells people that it was actually, you were the one who stole it, so he tells a lie. So in order to clear your own name, can you reveal what happened and speak Lashon Hara about him that he actually stole?
Yeah, so there are two variations. There are two different variations of your question. Your particular question is that the guy who actually committed the Aveira is accusing you. Are you allowed to say Lashon Hara, what would otherwise be Lashon Hara, in order to clear your name? The answer is you are allowed to. Where it gets a little more difficult is where it's not the bad guy that says it. In other words, let's assume the bad guy stole and he didn't say any Lashon Hara about you. But people think you're the one who did it. are you allowed to say, to reveal the identity in order to clear your name? That is more of a machlokus. That's more of a question. But where the perpetrator is the one that's defaming you, then for sure you're allowed to stand up and defend yourself. So in your particular question, I don't think there's any shiloh about that. Yeah.
I believe we heard during the yeshiva-wide shmooze today
Yeah.
that the Shulchan Aruch says a person can fulfill their chiyuv of learning Torah just by Kriyat Shema in the morning and the evening. I was wondering where we learn out that a person has a chiyuv to learn all day and where Bittul Torah comes from.
Yeah. So first of all, it's not in the Shulchan Aruch, it's in the Gemara itself. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and it's amazing, because Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was the one who was so committed to learning, he held there was no heter for a parnasa. Right? You just have to learn Yom V'Layla. He is the one that said, even if you only read Kriya Shema in the morning and in the evening, you have fulfilled the minimal requirement of Talmud Torah. So where do we get the idea that you got to learn more than that? So there are actually two sources. One source is in Kriya Shema itself on the verse V'shinantam levanecha, which literally means you should teach your child. But shinun is also a lashon of sharp, clarity. And this is a separate mitzvah to know the Torah, not just learn the Torah. That's an important idea, that one is supposed to know as much of the Torah as they can. So that itself would tend to necessitate that you spend time, because you have a mitzvah of Yedias HaTorah. If I read Shema in the morning and the evening, I'm not going to know above a Kama, above a Mitzvah, Kudshim, Tyrus, etc. So one understanding of the Chiyuv to learn as much as you can is from Yedias HaTorah. But there's another source, which interestingly enough is not in the Torah. It's in Sefer Yoshua. V'hagisa bo, you shall think about the Torah, yomam v'layla, day and night. This pasuk is the basis of the statement in Ma'ariv every night. Ki heim chayenu v'yorech yameinu. It is our life and the length of our days. Uvahem nehegeh, and in them we will contemplate yomam v'layla. Where did the Anshe Knesset Sagdola get that lashon uvahem nehegeh yomam v'layla from? Sefer Yoshua, v'hagisa bo yomam v'layla. Now, what's interesting is it's not a simple question, and that is, well, how can Yoshua, which is Nevi'im, define for us what is the Torah's commandment, right? A Navi cannot add to a mitzvah. If the Torah says all you need to do is Kriya Shema, Arvis v'Shachris, then how do you then create a chiyuv to learn all the time, because Hashem told Yoshua, V'gisa b'yom v'layla? That's a good question. I mean, isn't that nichlal in the general rule of Ein HaNavi Rishoi L'chadesh B'davar, that a Navi cannot add on to the mitzvahs, right? So our assumption has to be that this was not a new thing. In other words, it's not that the Torah only said Kriya Shema and Hashem now tells Yoshua we're changing the mitzvah to expand it. But rather, we often use the words of the Nevi'im to show us what was the original kavanah of the mitzvah. So, which means you actually have two aspects of Torah learning. You have a minimal thing that you're yotzei, but then you have an additional chiyuv to do as much as you can. Either because of Vishinantam Luvanecha, which in fact is indeed in the Torah, Yedias HaTorah, or from V'hagisa v'yom v'layla, which is a giloi that you got to do. You got to do as much as you can. Now, as much as you can is obviously a tricky question. There is, we poskin like Rabbi Yishmael, that there's a heter of parnasa. Also, people raise the interesting question. There's a general rule about Talmud Torah that you only stop learning for mitzvos that cannot be done by anybody else. So the reason why I stop learning in order to daven is because only I can do my mitzvah of tefillin. Nobody else can do it for me. That's called a mitzvah she'i efshar la'asos al yidei acherim. Now, this actually raises an interesting question. So what about the idea of I'm avatal my seder to go to a chasna, to go to a wedding, to go to a sheva brachos. So if the pshat is that you're a close friend and your presence is genuinely going to be missed, so that's considered to be a mitzvah that nobody else can do because your presence is different than somebody else's presence. So that would be the normal heter for a close friend to be mevatel Talmud Torah, to go to a chasna. But what if, you're not a particular, you're an acquaintance, you're part of the yeshiva, but you're not uniquely close to the chassan. So it's not so pashut. Now, the Gemara in Megillah does say, we are mevatel Talmud Torah for achnasas kala. But the Nitziv writes, that's a very limited thing. That means I'm sitting in the Beis Medrash, and a procession of a chasna is going by, so I should step outside and walk for 4 amos. It doesn't mean go out of town for the wedding. So I don't want to put a crimp in anybody, but there are interesting shilas about the heter to be mevatel Torah, to go to brises, to go to chasnas, and the like. But where things get very complicated, I know I'm digressing a little bit, is what is the role of chesed here? Pirkei Avos says the world stands on 3 pillars: Torah, Avodah, Gemilas, Chasadim. Now, most of the time when there are chesed opportunities, somebody else can do it who's not necessarily learning. So this is where I think you get painted into a very maybe unpleasant corner. So that means if I'm learning, I should never kind of do chesed because somebody else can do it. Intuitively, that does not sound totally correct. The Gemara mentions Abaya and Rava, Samar Goris Rabbah, were descendants of the house of Eli HaKohen. And you'll recall there was a curse on the house of Eli that all of his descendants would die relatively young. And it mentions that the great Rabbah, or Rabbah, depending on the girsa, died at the age of 40, which was young. Abaye managed to live until the age of 60, which also was regarded as relatively young, but Abaye got an extra 20 years. And the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah says why? Because Abaye was Isaac both in Torah and in Gemilas Chasadim. And that was able to overcome the Gezerah against Beis Eli. Rava was Osek in Torah. Doesn't mean he was a mean guy, but whatever. Rava was not Osek in Gemilas Chasadim. So even though his Torah protected him that he didn't die at 18 or whatever it is, but it couldn't take him beyond 40. So Avada, a Talmid Chacham, a person who's Kovei, who learns Torah, even if he's learning all day, has to make time for chesed, meaning you can't just apply the paradigm, somebody else can do it. It may be for a lot of activities, somebody says, can you take me to the airport if you have a car, right? If there are other people and you're learning, you can say other people. But to simply use that as a permanent, blockade of I don't do chesed, there is something that's very despicable about that. And for Keret, the Torah is not going to protect him. So what's the getter? So how much, in other words, if I'm not mechuyev to stop for chesed, because it's a mitzvah that other people can do, and yet I should because of my tikkun amidos, how much should I do? It's a bit of a mystery. Some want to suggest, based on a very interesting tshuva of Rav Moshe Feinstein. Rav Moshe Feinstein writes, many, many years ago, obviously, that just like there's a chiyuv to give meiser, 10% of your income for tzedakah, then a person should give 10% of his time to helping others. Now, what he was specifically talking about was learning with weaker people. He wasn't talking about chesed that's not learning, but it could very well be that Rav Moshe's svora might be extended to a certain allocation of chesed, that you have to build chesed into your curriculum as a Ben Torah. Now, Baruch Hashem, in yeshiva, the most common form of chesed that you can do, actually is connected to Talmud Torah. You learn with a weaker person. So in a sense, you're killing two birds with one stone, meaning maybe it's bittul Torah in some way because you're not learning at the advanced level that you could, but you're doing your chesed through your Torah learning. And Rav Moshe would suggest that one should be willing to give up to 10% of their time to that type of endeavor. Okay, but be it as it may, it's very, very clear that the idea of bittul Torah is really primarily derived from V'hagisa B'yom V'layla, which is in Sefer Yoshua, and it's not in the Torah, but it's understood that this is Megala to us. This shows us what the original intention of HaKadosh Baruch Hu was. Yeah.
What do you do when you have a teshuvos with a couple of different girsaos? And let's say you have...
I'm sorry, teshuvos with what?
Let's say any teshuva.
Yeah.
Shabbos teshuva sefer.
Yeah.
And you have a couple of different girsaos, and one of them, there are three okay girsaos that say some sort of a similar thing, sort of the same thing, versus one really good girsa which doesn't say the same thing at all. It says a completely different...
I'm sorry, when you refer to teshuvos, you mean...
I mean like a Shabbos teshuva sefer.
And you have three different girsaos in the Shabbos teshuva sefer itself?
So sometimes they bring similar girsaos to the girsa that it has.
Are you referring to they're quoting Gemaras with different girsaos, or there's a
No.
different girsa in the
Yeah,
tshuva?
there's a different girsa in tshuva itself.
Are these Rishonim or Achronim?
Either.
I mean, are you gonna find that in Igros Moshe or in
No,
Menchas?
it's more Rishonim. Let's say the
Okay.
Megillas or the Rambam. Like
Okay, yeah. So in the Shelos Teshuvos of Rishonim, there absolutely are going to be chilukei nuschos, meaning one edition may have a certain version of the tshuva, another will have a different version. Most of the time, they don't really change the meaning. There may be, slightly different wording, but you've actually come across changes in meaning, changes in pshat. Well, all I can tell you is you have no particular way of being machriya between them. You have to then look at what the achreinim regarded as the more authoritative psak, meaning there's no particular way that most of us could be machriya what is the correct nusach, what is the correct girsa in a given situation. Sometimes in the newer editions of the Shelos Teshuvos, there's all sorts of notes. The people who edited it put notes in it. Avrechem, chashuv es haminei chachamim, and usually the notes will often explore in the Ksav Yad Parma, right? They have manuscripts. In this Ksav Yad, this is what it says. In this Ksav Yad, this is what it says. And then they'll say something like, but the Beis Yosef in Chesed Mishpat Simon so and so brings this gersa. Meaning there are ways of finding out, but it would be very hard for most people. I mean, it would be looking at the Torah, looking at the Beis Yosef, looking at how later Achrayim brought it, what they considered to be authoritative, and then you could come to a conclusion. But if the only thing in front of you are the Shelos Teshuvos books themselves, you usually will not be able to figure it out. But make note of it. Make note that there are two different girsaos in it. Yeah.
When it comes to Sabra L'chaim, when a fly or spider comes near you, we just kill it instantly. Where do we draw the line where it's considered an animal, where we need to respect it and not kill it? And is hunting permitted for pleasure? And where does TNR come in? Why is it also if it's causing pain to animals?
I'm sorry, what's TNR?
Why can't we neuter?
Oh, yeah, I understand. Yeah, so a few things. There is an isur to cause unnecessary pain to animals, and the Gemara's maskana is that that's an isur deoraisa called sar balei chayim. But what's interesting is, the first thing I want to point out is that killing an animal, if you do it in a way that does not cause it pain, is actually not a violation of sar balei chayim. So as a result, if you can squish something immediately, there's actually no avera whatsoever, because you're getting rid of something that's bothering you, whatever it is, and you're doing it in a way that's not causing pain. Now, al pi Kabbalah, the Kabbalists have a very different cheshbon. The Kabbalists say it's very, very important never to take the life of anything, including ripping a leaf off a tree, because if God created it, it has a purpose in the Bria, that should not be tampered with. That's an extreme reverence for all life. So that's something to think about for sure. But if you're asking me in terms of the halacha of Sar Ba'alei Chayim, instantly killing something is not Sar Ba'alei Chayim. And with insects, it gets a little more complicated, even if it would be a prolonged thing, because it's not clear how developed their nervous systems are, meaning it's not really clear. It's hard to know. What does an insect feel? It's not what you call a sentient creature. But be it as it may, if you do it right away, their attack is no problem. That's why, for example, putting animals to sleep, euphemistically, as they say, if one has a dog has cancer, whatever it would be. So euthanizing a dog is actually considered to be preferable to letting the dog suffer through it. The opposite of human beings. Human beings, Rahman al-Islam, sometimes we have to let the person suffer because we're not allowed to euthanize because of the prohibition against murder. There is no prohibition against murder for animals. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Now, what was the, yes, there are three questions. What was the second one?
When it comes to neutering animals.
Oh, yes, neutering. Okay. Now, neutering is a real difficult problem. Obviously, you see from our own neighborhood here that the breeding of cats, and in many places dogs as well, can be absolutely out of control. As a result, what can happen is the animals themselves can starve in some places, although around Ohr Somayach, I think cats have a pretty good life. But in other places, animals can starve. Kittens can be abandoned and die of starvation. So one might have argued that the most humane thing you can do to prevent animal suffering is to neuter, spay the pets, or not the pets, the animals, so they will not reproduce. And fakert, that would prevent later Sar Ba'alei Chayim. In fact, there's a famous woman, at least within her circles, in the old city, who kind of travels around Yerushalayim, gathering up all of these stray cats to get them neutered and spayed, and then releases them back so they won't suffer and they won't carry disease or whatever it is. And yet, you correctly note that there's a tremendous halachic problem. Yeah, it's true that spaying, neutering would prevent Sar Ba'alei Chayim. But it's also true that there's an isur d'oraisa to castrate animals. Now, it's true that the isur d'oraisa is male castration. The isur of nekevos is d'rabanan, but whatever it is d'oraisa, d'rabanan. So under those circumstances, one could never make a cheshbon. Well, since I'm doing it so the animals shouldn't suffer, it's going to be mutter. You can't use that rationale when there's a beferish prohibition against sterilization of that type. Now, this is a big problem, by the way, for anyone that wants to be a veterinarian and be a shomer mitzvahs. We actually have a former Talmud of Ohr Somayach who's a veterinarian. Maybe there's more than one. And, veterinarians can do a lot of things. They give medicine and the like, but the bread and butter, the standard parnasa of a veterinarian is the spaying or neutering of dogs and cats. That's kind of the normal thing that you do. And then there's exotic things, heart transplants, whatever it is, but that's fairly rare. So the question is, how can I be a veterinarian if the job requires sterilization? I mean, if a vet were to say, I do everything except sterilization, he's not going to have any customers. Now, I'll give you another problem. Putting aside the veterinarian, this is a major problem for a pet owner. I own a dog. But if I'm not allowed to get my dog spayed, neutered, castrated, whatever term you want to use, then what do I do? So, if you're planning on being a pet owner and you haven't chosen your pet yet, the short answer is buy an animal that's already been neutered, so you don't have to do the aveira. It was already done. So, with respect to the owner of the animal, halacha has devised what you might call loopholes or tricks. And that is, it's like mechiras chametz. You kind of sell your dog to a guy, and have the guy bring the dog to the vet, and the vet takes care of it, and then the deal would be that the guy gives you back the dog. So the truth is, that heter is very problematical as well, because the isur of castration even applies to non-Jews. So why does that even work? But okay, but whatever it is, this is the minhag ha'olam, to be somech on mechira of the animal to the guy. But even if that's a heter for the pet owner, meaning I can get my animal neutered by selling it to a guy and having the guy bring it in, that's not a heter for the veterinarian. The veterinarian is Jewish. No, if he is Jewish. If he is Jewish, he's not allowed to castrate even a non-Jew's animal. So what works for me as pet owner is not automatically going to work to allow the veterinarian to do it. So there, the way it works is that a religious veterinarian does not do the final cut. As he preps the animal for the surgery, he ties the designated area, and the non-Jewish employee does the cut. And in that way, the act of castration was not performed by the Jew. But again, if anyone is planning to be a veterinarian, you do need to talk to a posek, talk to a Rav about all of these issues, because there are problems both mitzad the owner of the pet, and there are problems mitzad the veterinarian, if the veterinarian is an Orthodox Jew who wants to keep halacha. But all I can say is that Sar Balei Chayim cannot set aside an isur d'oraisa.
So you can kill the animal, but you can't neuter it.
That's correct. It's an interesting, and I mean, I hear your point, but that's exactly right. I can kill the animal because that's not castration, but I can't castrate. Now, it is interesting, though, that the prohibition of castration is only anatomical castration. That means taking a knife and cutting off the reproductive organs. There are forms of chemical castration, maybe castration is not the right word, in which through the ingestion of a drug or an injection, the testes shrivel up and are no longer capable of functioning. That is actually halachically permitted. Now, different techniques are being developed, which are non-surgical. And the non-surgical methods of sterilization actually are permitted to be employed. So you need to check what's available there. The last thing you asked is about hunting. Was that it? Yeah.
But we already really answered it with the
Okay.
dice right away.
Yeah, I just want to point out there actually is a famous tshuva from the Noda B'Yehuda, the great Rav of Prague in the 1600s, 1700s, who wrote about hunting, and he said, listen, hunting, number one, will often cause pain to animals, Sar Balei Chayim, but even if it doesn't, because you kill them right away, he says, recreational hunting is what Esavs do, not what Yaakovs do. And he says a Jew should not engage in getting pleasure. It's one thing. If I kill a bug, I said that's mutter. The bug is bothering me. It's disturbing me. But for me to go into the forest to shoot a deer, even if there's no isur to kill the deer, where is that coming from? What type of personality does such a thing? And the Noda B'Yehuda felt it was very, very inimical to the character of a Jew that is supposed to feel rachamim and compassion for all of God's creatures. So recreational hunting is very, very much discouraged. Yeah.
Does this carry over to fishing?
I think it would apply to fishing as well. So the chiluk would be the following. The chiluk would be that if you fish with the intention of eating the fish, so that's okay. Just like you could shecht, you can fish. You're allowed to fish and hunt. Of course, hunting you wouldn't have kosher meat, but you're allowed to fish or hunt for food. But if it's recreational in nature, to cause, in fact, again, fishing may, well, it's hard to know. I mean, hunting will often cause pain to animals. Animals don't die right away. Sometimes you don't cause pain to animals. Fishing, I think you almost always cause pain because it gets on the hook or whatever it is. So we would discourage fishing even more so than hunting in some ways because of the pain that animals experience. And I have to say that sometimes even in very, very religious neighborhoods, children are not sufficiently sensitized. Like, they taunt the cats, they'll throw stones at the cats, not because the cat is bothering them, but just because they want to elicit a reaction of screaming, or whatever, the shrieking, the cat's shriek here, and the like. And that's a very bad thing. It's a very bad thing. The Sefer HaChinuch writes that the yesod of Tzar Baalei Chayim is when we become desensitized to the suffering of any life, we ultimately become desensitized to human beings as well. So it is important to have that midah of rachamim and the like. Yeah.
Is there any halachic reason why a male cannot be an OBGYN doctor?
Yeah, so the question is there any halachic reason why a man could not be a gynecologist, obstetrician, meaning his patients are women? So here's the thing. According to halacha, it is absolutely permitted for a male doctor to see female patients, even if he physically touches them and examines them. And the same thing is the opposite. A woman could be a doctor that examines men. And that is because, although halacha does prohibit touching the opposite gender, at least in an affectionate way, that's only if it's affectionate touching, hugging, kissing. Shaking hands is a machlokes. That's good for the machlokes. Is that called affectionate or not? But let's say we're machmer on that. But in a professional context, such as medical treatment, and even things less significant, a barber. See, technically, a man could go to a female barber. A woman could go to a male barber, because that's what's called negia, physical touching, she'ena shel chiba, that is not a reflection of love or friendship or camaraderie or the like. So for sure it's mutter once you are an OBGYN. Let's say you weren't from at the time. Now, the question is, should that be the profession that a Ben Torah would choose l'chatchila? Assuming you're already a frum person and you're looking for a medical specialty to choose, would that be the specialty you should choose? So I cannot tell you halachically it's usur. I cannot tell you halachically it's usur because, after all, it's not negia shel chiba, so it's mutter. But I will tell you that I think Das Torah would generally discourage that as a deliberate choice of profession. And the reason simply is that even when halacha permits it, things can happen. In other words, a man that's hanging around with women, naked and etc., boundaries can be crossed, things can be violated, Yetzer Haras can be very, very strong. So certainly it's probably better not to put yourself in that situation. People ask a related question about therapists. People say, well, okay, it's one thing when you're physically touching the other gender, but what if you're a psychologist, a therapist, social worker? All you do is talk. Is there anything wrong with going to a woman therapist? Is there anything wrong with a woman going to a male therapist? Anything wrong? So the truth of the matter is, in some ways, a mental health therapist might be in a more dangerous position because that creates emotional bonding, meaning to say, the doctor is simply physically examining the body. There may or may not be arousal, etc. But with a therapist, you're opening up your soul. So imagine the situation of a woman who feels neglected by her husband. Her husband doesn't understand her. Her husband doesn't sympathize with her pain. And every week she goes to this guy that she can talk to for 50 minutes, who really, really listens and understands. I know that therapists are trained that these things shouldn't happen. This is called transference of affection. But I can tell you from firsthand knowledge. I mean, there was a Ben Torah who was a therapist, an avrech, a cuddle guy, but he was also a therapist. And he was treating a married woman who felt a little neglected by her husband. Well, I can tell you, this lady essentially fell in love with the therapist. And he felt he had to disengage, and she went crazy. She was treating it like a divorce. Says, he dropped me, whatever. She was reliving the whole rejection. So I'm telling you this story not for the gossip value of it. I'm telling you this story because this is a very good example that even though technically there's no negia, there's no touching at all, the laws of yichud were observed in terms of an open door, whatever it is. They didn't violate yichud. But things can be mutter al pidin, but they do have a potential for danger. And therefore, when a person is choosing what type of line of work they have, they should try to choose something that doesn't pose those risks. You know, people sometimes look at halacha and they say, oh, halacha is like so medieval. A man can't be alone with a woman, a man can't touch a woman, etc. A woman can't have a skirt above the knee. Like, what are you saying? All men are predators, all men are animals. You know, you let a man alone with a woman, things are going to happen. And they make fun of halacha. Well, let me tell you this. If you look in the employment manuals of the Fortune 500 companies, look at IBM, look at General Electric. Now, they were very concerned with sexual harassment lawsuits in recent years, you know. They've been sued for, you know, for men doing things to women or whatever it will be. So they're not acting because of lishma or tshuva. But they'll actually write things like, no man should be alone with a woman in his office, and women are enjoined to dress in ways that are not overly sexually provocative. Men should observe boundaries and not, you know, hug or kiss women. In other words, it's almost as if IBM is kind of translating the Shulchan Aruch into English. Now, as I say, it's not because IBM has a spirit of Kedusha and Shuva and the like. They're doing it because they want to avoid litigation, which can cost them millions and millions of dollars. But it does mean that the Torah and Chazal were not being primitive here. They were being realistic. They were being brutally realistic. And that is, sexual arousal is a very powerful and potent force. And when you don't have proper boundaries, anything can happen. And that's essentially how it is. So the point I'm making is, in a long-winded way, that even if something is halachically permitted, you know, you should be careful in terms of where you go with it. But to specifically answer your question, a frum Jew can be an OB-GYN, but I would not advocate it as a lechatchila choice of profession. Okay, yeah.
What are the limits of women's religious leadership capacity, such as Devorah from prophets?
Yeah. So the issue of women's religious leadership roles has become a very big issue in the more modern Orthodox community over recent years. Particularly the issue of women rabbis. There are now Orthodox movements, and maybe you can debate if they're Orthodox, but movements that use the name Orthodox that have already ordained women as whatever it is. There's a women's yeshiva, etc. Different titles, machlokas, what they go, maharat they go with. Okay, whatever the title is. Here in Eretz Yisrael, some of them have started it. So it's a delicate balance. On one hand, I think it's understood that women are competent and capable, smart, certainly able to learn, able to absorb complex information, and women have talents in many areas, counseling people and the like. But the particular title of rabbi, according to halacha, is only limited to people who are kosher to be a judge, a religious judge. Women are not kosher to be witnesses. Women are not kosher to be judges. So the title of Rav would not be appropriate. Now you did raise the question. Well, what do you mean a woman cannot be a judge? What about Devorah? Devorah is one of the judges, shofetes, and it mentions that she would judge people under the palm tree, Tomer Devorah. The Sefer was named after that idea. The reason why she judged outside was because of Yichud, but she judged outside. So Tosfos asked the question, what about Devorah? And Tosfos says, and a woman can be a judge if both litigants have submitted to her authority. Meaning she cannot compel someone, like a regular judge, to go before her, But if both parties want to submit to her authority, they can do so. Now, based on that teshuvos, again, I don't want to get in big trouble here, the argument has been made, well, wait a second here. If you're telling me that if both parties agree that the woman should be their judge, that is a valid acceptance. Well, what if a whole shul agrees that a woman should be their rabbi? Let's say you have 100 members. 100 members want the woman. Could that be shoehorned into the Devora precedent? Maybe so. But then you have tznius issues and the like. So all I can tell you is this is a major machlokus, but the mainstream from world, I don't just mean the yeshiva world, I mean even the mainstream centrist Orthodox world, the YU world, let's say, do take the position that women should not have rabbinic roles, but they can have roles as heads of school, they can have roles as educators, they can have roles as yoatzot, which means helping women observe the laws of nida and providing them guidance. So there is a recognition that women should be recognized and their talent should be utilized, but not yet in the formal situation of being a Rav of a Kehillah. That would not be considered proper. But as I say, you know, the old saying is when you draw lines in the sand, the lines keep on getting crossed. So I personally think, historically, the maintenance of these distinctions is going to get progressively harder. If a woman can do A, B, C, D, E, F, G, then at what point are you going to say, but you can't cross over into H? It does get harder as times go on. But it's a live issue, and as I say, the left-wing Orthodox movements have already hired trained women rabbis and hired them. Yeah.
What's the Torah view of freedom of speech?
Yeah, what is the Torah's view of freedom of speech? Well, I can tell you this, it is not as expansive as the constitutional First Amendment. Obviously, can you say anything? Does Judaism say you can say anything? Well, there's a lot of things you can't say. You can't blaspheme God. You can't speak Lashon Hara. You can't make fun of the Torah or the mitzvos or the Jewish people. So there are a lot of limits HaKadosh Baruch Hu put on what we're able to say. However, if you factor out the Lashon Hara and the blasphemy and the disrespect for Torah, which is absolutely forbidden, within learning, there's a lot of room for debate, for discussion. Take a page of Gemara. Debate, arguments. Jews argue. We argue over Halachos. We argue over Hashkafa. We argue over politics. That's good. That's good. As long as it doesn't turn into personal insult and the like. The notion of argument, the whole yesod of Torah Shebaal Peh is that through expressing different viewpoints, each of us get greater clarity in terms of what is the emes. This is called a dialectical method of achieving understanding. And if you look, lahavdil, the classical defense of freedom of speech in legal philosophy is exactly this point, that an exchange of opposite viewpoints brings people closer to understanding the truth. But as I say, so I think Judaism subscribes to that philosophically, but it has a lot of limits. So, for example, we would not encourage freedom of speech as to whether there's a God. We would not encourage freedom of speech regarding atheism or kfira, or was the Torah given by Hashem? In other words, Judaism requires acceptance of certain yesodos, but within those yesodos, arguments can be very robust and very detailed and very strong. So I would have to say that our freedom of speech is much more limited than the secular concept. Yeah.
Maybe just answer your beautiful
Sorry, say again?
If I can answer your beautiful words that the Chazal said with the belt of bomb, our speech is in the Torah.
With the Barti, speaking of Torah. Yeah.
We can.
V'lo b'dvorim b'teilim. Yeah, well, of course. Yeah, bittul Torah. Yeah, I understand that. Well, yeah, but if you take that, I mean, you don't even talk about politics.
Exactly.
What do they say? Rev Gifter when Rav Gifter was a bacher, like in the 1930s, he was just a yeshiva bacher. And Rabbi Chanan Wasserman was in the United States in 1938, which is very poignant because Hitler invaded Poland in 39, and Rabbi Chanan, they knew what would happen when Hitler invaded Poland, and indeed the 3 million Jews in Poland were wiped out. Rabbi Chanan was given many offers to stay in the United States, and he refused. He said if Hashem decreed that his yeshiva will die, he will die with his talmidim. He actually went back to essentially die in Poland. Okay. But he was here in 1930, not here, he was in America in 1938, and Rav Gifter went to visit him. People went to visit one of the great Gedolei Ador. And when he came to Rav Chanan's hotel room, Rav Chanan was reading a Yiddish paper, a newspaper. So Rav Gifter was a bacher. He obviously wouldn't say anything, but Rav Gifter looked a little shocked. So Rav Chanan noticed that Rav Gifter was shocked. You see one of the Gedolei Ador reading a newspaper. So Rav Chanan said, "What's wrong?" He says, "Every Jew has to make time to read the paper every day and finish Shas every year." He says, "This is part of the this is in addition to your regular learning, a little newspaper time, and be sure you finish Shas in the course of the year." He says a Jew should know what's going on. Yeah.
Does that mean if you don't finish Shas, you shouldn't read the newspaper?
If what?
If you don't finish Shas, you shouldn't read the newspaper?
I think that was the implication. I think that was Rabbi Chanan's inner message, meaning it's good to be informed, but you have to be a person the Torah is so important to you that you kind of try to finish Shas every year. By the Netziv, the same thing. I think I mentioned a number of times already, the Torah Tamima, Reb Baruch Halevi Epstein, who was the Aruch HaShulchan's son and the Netziv's nephew, wrote a biography, a huge biography, 4 volumes of his father and his all of the period of history. But the 4th volume is a biography of the Netziv, his uncle, and the closing of the Volozhin Yeshiva. And they translated it into English, My Uncle the Netziv. And this was a bit of a controversial book once it was translated. So it actually got recalled. It was sent out as a fundraiser. We then got a letter recalling it, and then for sure everybody read it. You get a book in the mail, which you might not even read, and then you get a letter, please send it back for a full refund. For sure you're going to read it then. So there were a lot of things that were controversial. One was the implication that the Netziv was not against secular studies in Volozhin. The other were some passages about women learning Gemara, a lot of different things that were against the conventional wisdom. But one of them that also rankled people was he would describe the Netziv every Shabbos would read a number of Yiddish newspapers. And he said this was his Onik Shabbos, that he gets to read, he came on Friday, he gets to read the news of what's going on in the world. So people thought that was sacrilegious. How could that be? But of course, let me point out, the Netziv finished every Shabbos, Maseches Shabbos and Erevin. That's pretty unbelievable. Maseches Shabbos is like over 150 blot. Erevin is around 120 blot. Every Shabbos you finish those 2 Maseches. So what I would say is, sure, read the paper. You learn Shabbos and Erevin, you can read the paper too. But if you're not finishing Shabbos and Erevin, use your time to learn a little more instead of reading the paper. So I think that was part of Rabbi Chanan's point. Yeah.
To piggyback on your question and your answer to your question, what are the limits of how we may use our speech in political debate amongst Jews, like in the Holy Land? There are plenty of Jews who disagree with each other on various issues. How far may we go in expressing them without doing something that offends other Jews in a way that's halakhically unpermissible?
So, listen, there is theory and there is practice, meaning to say ideas, as long as they don't violate Torah, are legitimate subjects of debate. Debate ideas. Are we allowed to give land away for peace? Talk about the machlokas. Can we trade? Can we release terrorists to get back hostages? These are halachic debates. They can be discussed. But what happens often is, in political debate, it degenerates into a very personal attack. you're an apikoros, you're a kofar, you're a molek, you don't care about the Jewish people. That is improper. One should not ridicule, one should not insult, one should not castigate people as Amalek or Kofar and the like. So I think you have to differentiate between the ideas and the personification of the ideas. Now, in real life, that never happens. In real life, the two are always going to be collapsed together, and that's unfortunate.
How do we maintain that separation from devolving into personal attacks when we are of the conviction that the other player may not be abiding by those rules? How do we engage in that?
So that could be part of the debate itself, meaning you could say something like, I do not want to descend into personal invective, but I say with all respect that you are communicating that type of message. And say it in a non-angry way and bring out that point. That could be part of the discussion as well. But, you shouldn't be the one that says you're an idiot, you're an apikoros, you're an evil person. You kind of say, I'm getting the impression that there's a certain message you're trying to bring out that I think is not the appropriate way a political debate should be conducted. So, it's all in the way you say it. That's exactly right. When do you cross the line? But ideas are certainly debatable, discussable. This is a problem in Eretz Yisrael generally, and this is actually, I think, America goes through the same thing, but at least historically, America was maybe a little better. In Eretz Yisrael, no matter what the issue is, and this is religious, secular, within religious, whoever takes a position different than me is just either evil or an idiot. Meaning, I take a certain position, you take a different position, you're wrong. But not only you're wrong, you're stupid, you're evil, you're Amalek, you're kofar, or if it comes from the other side, you're a parasite, you're a bloodsucker. Now, historically, the way Americans would discuss, although that's changed a lot now too with Trump and the like, is I have a point, you have a point, and my response is there is something valid in what you're saying, but I think you need to consider something extra. And at that point, things get advanced a little bit, because when a person feels legitimated, they open themselves up. I once had occasion, should I tell you the name? I once actually it was supposed to be a debate with Alan Dershowitz. Now, it was funny because Alan Dershowitz was actually a teacher of mine. I knew him when I was in law school. But I was a last-minute substitute because he was supposed to debate a famous guy. And the famous guy couldn't show up at the end, so they got me as second, third, fourth stringer. And Dershowitz was offended, really. He was offended because I'm supposed to debate a famous guy. What is this? Whatever. So I began, and Dershowitz, again, this was a Chabad event, strangely enough. And I think the Chabad people were very angry at the organizer who invited Dershowitz, because Dershowitz comes in and starts attacking Orthodox Judaism and saying, Dershowitz he came from family. And he made the point, he said, I'm not like you Orthodox Jews. He says, I know the Talmud and I study the Talmud, and then I make up my mind, should I accept it or not. I think, I evaluate, not like you people who are just automatic pilot people who never think. So I remember that the Chabad leadership were looking at the organizer who invited him with these deadly staring eyes. What did you do here? So when I got up, Dershowitz was very hostile to, this little nobody. And I had a Maisa with Dershowitz from 10 years before when I was a law student. And the Maisa was on the very first day of orientation. I was wearing a kippah. He went over to me and said, I see you're an Orthodox Jew. I want you to know if you ever have any problems with the law school administration, I will be happy and privileged to help you out. So I recounted that story about that Dershowitz is a person who cares about the Jewish people. And you could see he softened up. He was like this. And as I told the story, his body started relaxing. He felt good. And then, when I tried to defend Torah, he came up with his own defenses of Torah. In other words, he kind of supported my position. So why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this for the simple point that Shlomo HaMelech said a long time ago in the book of Mishlei, Manerach Yoshev Chema, a soft answer dissipates angers and resentment. So if you have a different position than me, instead of my saying you're an idiot, which will just make you defensive and hostile, I try to see the possible merit in what you're saying. And then you'll be receptive to my side. That's not the minhag in Eretz Yisrael. In Eretz Yisrael, there's always like a polarization, which is why the religious and the secular don't never come together, really. So I'll give you an example. Okay, I'm going to get mail on this, which I'm really not in the mood for. But let's take the army. I'm not going to address the merits of it, but let's assume like some secular Jew goes over to you and says, how can it be that you people sit in the Beis Hamikdash and you learn Torah and you take your vacations, while there are so many other people who are dying in Gaza? Don't you care? Right? You're going to hear that. Maybe you've heard that already. So, what do I say to that? I mean, let's assume I do believe, as B'nai Torah, that we need to be in the Beis Hamikdash, right? So I'm not going to just say you're right. But what I could say is something like, instead of saying, Apikoris, get out of here, you're going to go to hell, which is typically the way people respond. What if I say, I understand how painful this is for you. And I understand that you might feel betrayed. I get it. But there are other considerations that, we need spiritual assistance. We need that. There's a different way of talking. And you would be very amazed. That different way of talking changes the picture very, very, very much. And this is Shlomo HaMelech, who was the wisest of all people. Ma nerach yoshev chema. So instead of assuming the other side is all wrong, try to identify something that's emes in what they're expressing, and then bring in the other factors that have to be considered. You see? Now, I know that some people disagree with me because they say you can't make any concessions to the apikorsim or whatever. I don't know. I think sometimes a certain type of concession is a way of strengthening the point that you want to make. Yeah.
Can I ask you specifically about the Dati Leumi argument about that? Where
Yeah.
They say that they're also following the Torah.
Yeah.
And even a kind of mitzvah part of that too.
Sure. So I've talked about this a lot. Every time I do talk about it, like the Kutzker Rebbe said, when you walk in the middle of the road, you get hit with traffic coming in both directions, and I get hit with traffic in both directions. Obviously, you're correct. The issue of army service is not just religious versus secular, but within the religious world itself, there is a major division of opinion. The standard, although not the invariable, Haredi position is, yeshiva students should not serve in the army. Even Haredim or not yeshiva students should not serve in the army. The Dati Leumi position is that it is a mitzvah, it's a mochemes mitzvah. Klal Yisrael is besakana, and they create yeshivas, which are called Hester yeshivas, which combine military service with Torah learning. And there is no question that sometimes the Haredi world kind of denies, doesn't even acknowledge the existence of Hester students. But some of the Hester students are absolutely outstanding in every way, meaning in their Yiras Shamayim, in their learning, in their hasmada, and in their devotion to national service. So this is a huge machlokus, meaning the Haredi Rosh Yeshivas have still taken the position that although potentially a person could remain a Ben Torah in this environment, it is so challenging, it is so difficult, it is so spiritually dangerous that we need to try to protect our kids from that. So that's a machlokas. Again, that's a machlokas. But once again, I think this is a machlokas that we have to have respect on both sides. We have to understand that Torah learning is absolutely essential for Klal Yisrael's success in the world. But we also have to appreciate that those who are making military sacrifices, certainly the Hester guys, are doing it legamri l'shem shemayim. So I would apply the same paradigm of not putting people down here. Yeah.
Oh, I think he had a question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Are you
Okay.
allowed to exercise on Shabbos?
Yeah, are you allowed to exercise on Shabbos? The halacha actually is no if you'll be generating a sweat. It's an isur d'rabbanan. It's not one of the 39 malachos of Shabbos, but the halacha is that you don't exercise in a vigorous way that generates a sweating. So the types of exercise you can do are exercise where it's not recognizable that it is exercise, such as walking. Right? You're walking in the street, so you can walk, if you're within the Techum, you can walk 10 miles. And, people just see you walking, they don't know what you're doing. But it shouldn't be jogging, it shouldn't be running, it should not be lifting weights and the like. Again, it's an isur d'rabbanan. Yeah.
Are women allowed to learn Gemara, and if so, to what extent is it permissible?
Yeah. So this is, again, one of the major divides between what you might call more modern left-wing orthodoxy and more yeshiva. Okay, this doesn't automatically correspond to Haredi, Dati Leumi. In other words, it's interesting that the divisions and the denominations do not totally match up. In America, we have, let's say, modern orthodoxy, centrist orthodoxy, yeshiva, Chassidish. Here we have Haredi, Dati Leumi. Although on one level, Haredi, Dati Leumi might correspond with yeshivish versus modern. It's not always the case, but the correspondences are not exact. But generally speaking, here's what the Rambam says. The Rambam paskins in Hilchos Talmud Torah that women, number one, are exempt from learning Torah. That's a general rule. They're exempt. But the Rambam says if they learn Torah, they still get reward as an Eina Mitzvah V'Yaisa. But the Rambam says a father should only teach his daughter Torah shebichsav, the written Torah. A father should not teach his daughter the oral Torah. So the Rambam says it's actually usur for a father, for a parent, to teach a daughter the Torah Sheba'al Peh. Now, that itself raises interesting questions, because how can you teach Torah Shebichsav without Torah Sheba'al Peh? I mean, when I teach my daughter eye for an eye, I'm not allowed to say that it means money because that's Torah Sheba'al Peh. Okay, so obviously the basic interpretations of Torah Sheba'al Peh are part of Torah Shebichsav, but we mean you don't sit and learn a Rebbe Kiveger with your daughter. Now, this is the historical reason why women were generally not learning Gemara. It's based on the Rambam, which in turn is based on a statement of Rabbi Eliezer, the Tanach, that says, he who teaches his daughter Torah, which the Rambam understands Torah Sheba'al Peh, is teaching her tiflus, something that's meaningless and not appropriate for her. Now, I do want to share with you a very interesting shita of the Prisha. The Prisha is a commentary on the Torah by Yeshua Falka Cohen, one of the greatest of the early Achronim, in the time of the Levush, the Ramah. And he says the following interesting diuk. It does not say a woman is not allowed to learn Gemara. It says a father is not allowed to teach his daughter Gemara, or Torah Sheba'al Peh. So says the Prisha, what is really being prohibited is to force it upon her, to make her part of a mandatory curriculum, which you have to do with your son. But if a woman becomes an adult, which is 12 years old, and on her own, she wants to learn Gemara, the Prisha actually says we are allowed to teach it to her, and it's okay. Now, not everybody would agree with that, but I will tell you that a number of poskim have said that there is nothing wrong with a woman learning Gemara if this is what she wants to do. And it's been pointed out that in an era where women can be lawyers, can be doctors, can be astrophysicists, can be molecular biologists, to then say, oh, but you can't do Gemara. It's too hard for you to understand, or whatever it would be, doesn't make a lot of sense. So, in reality, therefore, the short answer to your question is a woman allowed to learn Gemara? The answer is she is allowed to learn Gemara, but at an elementary school level, it should not be made part of the curriculum to push her into it. But if she gravitates towards that area, you're allowed to accommodate. Now, obviously, there'll be serious considerations. Can a woman, go to a male shir? There may be issues. But I'll tell you myself, when I used to give Dati Leumi many, many years ago when I was in Maryland, and for around 2 years, a young woman used to come to my Dati Leumi shir. Now she's been living in Eretz Yisrael for many years. She's a very, very renowned and respected teacher. And she sat at a separate table. She did not sit at a table with them. She sat sat over there, away from everybody. And my Daf Yomi shir was late at night, and a lot of people were falling asleep. And when you're teaching a shir, you want to get an impression. Are people getting you or not? Something it's like hard Gemara, and you're looking. So maybe I shouldn't say this, but there were times that I was pretty sure, like I lost everybody. Nobody was getting it. It was like 10 o'clock at night. But I would look at her table surreptitiously, She'd be nodding along. So I said, all right, Baruch Hashem, somebody got this. So she was the one that always got what I was teaching. So, you have to be careful about tznius. That is a major issue. But in terms of Gemara itself, it's fine. And in fact, historically, there are many, many instances, well, maybe not many, but not infrequently, that there were great women who knew much, much, much Gemara. There's a legend, at least, that Rashi did not have any sons. Rashi had 5 daughters, and all 5 daughters learned Gemara from Rashi. What better teacher could there be? And there's even some Masorah that the Perush on Maseches Nedarim, which is called Rashi's Perush, was actually written by Rashi's daughters. More recently, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach was a brother-in-law of Rav Shvadran, who was the famous Maggid of Yerushalayim. They married sisters. And Rebbetzin Shvadran was a very, very learned woman. She knew a lot of Gemara and the like. And there was a time that Rav Shlomo Zalman was speaking at the Shabbos table, and he said over a vort, and Rebbetzin Shvadran said, "You forgot Taisus and Beya, Davches. How could you say that?" And Rav Shlomo Zalman thought for a moment, and he said, "You are right. I forgot the Taisus." So it's very, very clear that historically there were women that were learning Gemara, and I'm assuming the halachic basis is that of the prisha, that if a woman on her own wants to learn, we're allowed to teach her. We just don't make it part of a mandatory curriculum for women. Yeah.
Is it better to limit that to the laws that pertain to them as far as neuter, as far as Shabbos?
Well,
as far as, because the other things as
I don't know. I mean, if the prisha did not. I understand what you're saying. You're saying is.
they can probably
Yeah.
teach it to anyone, so it would be a waste
Yeah.
of time. Perhaps.
Well, okay. I mean, the svara you say is the idea of why women make birchos haTorah, right? Well, how could women make birchos haTorah? They're not chayiv in Torah learning. So the Beis Yosef says, well, they are chayiv to learn the mitzvos that they keep, and therefore that allows birchos haTorah. So you're saying the same svara about women learning Gemara. On the other hand, the prisha didn't seem to say that. The prisha seemed to say, like an Eina Mitzvah V'Yaisa, she could learn Torah. Now, I will tell you this. One of the fears Chazal had, and the truth is, you see a little bit that it's a real fear, is that a woman might get so involved and so fascinated with the intricacies of Talmud Torah that she'll be less interested in diapering a baby or whatever it would be. She'll want to be in kollel, and she'll want to marry a husband that will support her in kollel. And Chazal were very, very worried that too much intense involvement in the complexities of Torah Shebaal Peh might undermine the family structure. Now, if that doesn't sound realistic to you, I can tell you that I'm aware of this. A woman spoke to me once, this was a long time ago, this was 25 years ago, where she says she's looking for a guy that will support her in learning and the like. So these things actually happen. So that is a fear. On the other hand, let me just go back and say, but if that's what you're worried about, don't you have the same problem with lawyers, doctors, astrophysicists? You have the same problem. Any intensive career is going to create that potential conflict with family. So this goes back to the argument that if the woman is going to be a doctor, then why can't she learn Gemara? I mean, why would Gemara be, God forbid, more damaging than any other discipline that requires a lot of time? So again, I don't want to confuse you with too many different ideas. Bottom line is that the Prisha does allow women to learn Gemara, but he interprets the Rambam to mean we don't require it as part of her mandatory curriculum. By the way, a little-known thing is that Lubavitcher Rebbe said it was a good thing. Now, it's a funny thing because in the formal educational system of Chabad, it's very traditional. No, women don't learn Gemara. And yet the Rebbe said, Bisman Aseh, he said it was actually a good thing. So it's an interesting point that he was ahead of his community as to what was considered a proper education. Yeah.
Is there any isur in selective surgery, like plastic surgery? And is there any isur in doing oral surgery that not necessarily is necessary, but could cause problems down the line? For say, wisdom teeth removal when not necessary.
Yeah. So those are two very, very different questions. Let me address the second question because I think the second question is more pshat. Is there anything wrong with a person undergoing some surgery that is not correcting a crisis right now, but it may prevent some later suffering down the road, such as removal of wisdom teeth to prevent the impaction or whatever it is later on? There, I believe that is very justifiable and very, very mutter, because ultimately you're doing it to prevent a problem down the road, and that's nichlal in the Torah's heter of refuah. Refuah is not limited to an actual sickness that exists. It can also include prophylactic, that means advanced measures that are taken to prevent a problem. Now, the first question is a little more complicated, and that's elective cosmetic surgery because you want to look better. You want to look better, whatever it will be. Now, here it also depends. If, God forbid, somebody's a burn victim or there's disfigurement, for sure, that's mutter too. That's right. The plastic surgery you do on a burn victim is a medical procedure, like every other procedure. Similarly, some bring from Mataisis and Bava Kama that if a person is ashamed of their appearance, they were born a certain way and they're embarrassed to walk out looking the way they look out, that's nichlal too in refuah and it's mutter. But the question becomes, where something is not embarrassing, it's not disfigurement, but a person wants to just look better, are you allowed to go under surgery to heal that? So there's a big machlokas. There are many, many poskim that say purely elective cosmetic surgery may be usur, because there is an isur to be chovel. There's an isur to wound yourself. There's an isur to cut into yourself. And chayvel is mutter for refuah, but chayvel is usur if it's not for a refuah purpose. Rav Moshe, however, does write that the isur of chovel is only when it's done with aggressive, negative intent, and not when it's done for a constructive purpose. So he would allow some type of cosmetic surgery. So this would be a big, big machlokas. Now you'd be very, very surprised, and maybe you'd be very dismayed, that elective cosmetic surgery is very common among frum girls, like 16 or 17-year-old, in Chassidish communities. because they feel that unless they look a certain way, they won't be able to get a shidduch. Now, putting aside the halachic issues, these are actually psychological problems of body image and the superficiality of a religious culture that is putting such a premium on certain types of looks. And, the basic message would be, hey, a guy that's not going to accept you unless you undergo cosmetic surgery is not the right guy to marry anyway, right? Because he's not looking at you, he's looking at some Hollywood version of you. So those are hashkafic issues to consider. But in terms of the etzem heter, some poskim say there's an isur of chabura or chavala, and others say it's not a chavala derech nitzayon. Nitzayon is hostility, fighting, and therefore it would be ikaret and be mutter. But again, I want to repeat, if there's disfigurement or if there's embarrassment, for sure it is going to be mutter, and prophylactic surgery is mutter as well.
It's subjective.
Say again?
Subjectively, doesn't look good, or objectively? Does it be objectively? Or
What are you talking about? Embarrassment?
embarrassing?
No, I think we would look at subjective states of mind, but it has to be subjective humiliation, meaning it's not subjective, I want to look better. Subjective that when I walk out, I feel inadequate, I feel people are laughing at me, that. So, that subjectivity would factor in to what is a busha, what is an embarrassment. Okay? Yeah.
The Rambam writes in Moreh Nevuchim that angels have free will, bechira to some extent. What's the pshat?
Yeah, this is a very, very difficult, complicated sugya. We normally, right, the standard thing we always say is, the difference between a malach and a person is that angels are fixed, right? Angels are whatever they are, and they don't make choices, they don't make bechira, they're programmed to behave a certain way, and a human being is a baal bechira, I can choose to do something or not do something. People compare angels to the chess pieces on the board other than the pawn, and a human being is a pawn. A pawn on the chessboard is the lowest piece, but only the pawn can become a queen when it reaches the other side of the board. Angels are all of those, the bishop and the rook, right? The angels are much higher than the pawn, but the pawn can grow, right? So it's a very nice mashal. Of course, the pawn can only become a queen, the pawn cannot become a king because there's only one king, that's HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Right? So no one can become the king, but the queen, yeah. So that's the standard conventional wisdom. Angels are not Baalei Bechira, they're machines that are programmed a certain mission. And yet, you are correct that there are Makaros and there are Midrashim, it's not just the Rambam, that indicates that angels sometimes rebel against Hashem, or angels argue with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, etc. And that connotes the notion that they're not just a machine, they're not just a computer, but in fact they exercise bechira. It's hard to have a precise get. It seems to be that there is a limited range of choices they can make within the specifics of their overall mission. They could argue with God. They could say initially, I don't want to do it, etc. But they're limited to a particular mission, and therefore anything outside of that mission, they bechlal have no shaykhs to. So they don't have a general bechira to violate God's word, but within their job, they have that kind of autonomy there. Yeah.
You were speaking on the issue of superficiality, perceived and not perceived. Within the from community, would you be able to, in another way, diagnose the issue of how we got to this place, if you have any thoughts on why?
I'm sorry, which issue are you addressing? Why people are focusing on externals?
Yes, the issue of superficiality that would compel women in the film community to make augmentations to themselves for their own natural
Yeah.
what they want.
Well, the simplest answer is that it just shows you that no matter how insular your community is, the outside world comes in. I mean, we live in a Hollywood culture. We live in a culture that glorifies certain body types over other body types. Even if you live in Williamsburg or you live in Squaretown, whatever it is, there are going to be billboards, there are going to be magazines, there are going to be things that you're going to see. There are going to be images that you'll come across, and they mold your consciousness in different ways. And maybe the degeneration rate might be much slower than general society, but we get affected. It's a big mistake when people say, oh, I could see what I want, I could walk through. I don't get affected. I don't get affected. Truth is, we get affected. We get affected in all sorts of ways. And I think what's the term? The commodification of women is one of the ways that we've gotten affected, that women have to be a certain thing, commodity, and they have to look a certain way. I mean, that's why eating disorders. I don't want to say that's why, it's a complicated question, but one of the reasons why eating disorders among women, and particularly among Jewish teenagers, is very, very high, because eating disorders, Teenage girls, yeah.
Not teenage boys, but
No, mainly girls. Eating disorders, I mean, there are men or boys that have eating disorders, but it's overwhelmingly a female problem, because there's such a fixation with body image. So people eat and vomit up and stop eating and starve themselves, and anorexia is a life-threatening condition. People die from it. And it all comes from the fixation of the body image. And that is a product of Hollywood culture. And that can affect the most Chassidish community even.
if we are affected by it, is there a way to address it? Perhaps, if not insulate ourselves from it, or counteract it?
Well, yeah, there are. To be fair, there are machanchos and seminaries and schools that are very. I'm not inventing. I'm not the first one who've identified this problem. They've identified this as a very, very serious problem. They are devising programs in the schools to talk about this, to give people a good sense of what's called body image. I know it sounds a little secular, but it is a legitimate Jewish concern. People are trying to work on it. I just recently wrote a letter, a michtav bracha, on a book that a woman teacher wrote precisely about developing a course in this area for teenage girls. So it's something that's actually needed. Less so for men. I mean, men have other issues, but not that particular issue so much. But for girls, it's a very, very big thing. So remember, when you have daughters, to be mechanecher, to focus on a healthy sense of who she is. Yeah.
Perhaps somewhat relatedly to this, but different. If one finds oneself working or spending a lot of time in an environment where certain values aren't practiced, everybody tells a lie, a bit of lashon hara here and there, small lies here and there, broken promises are normal, so on and so forth. How does one make sure that something like that, not let it affect you?
Yeah, the Rambam writes that if a person finds himself in an immoral environment, an environment where people are not living up to ethical, good standards, he should run away and go to the desert, go to the mountains, get out, live in isolation. So they say, the Satmar Rebbe asked the Chassidish, says, so what do we do today? We're surrounded. So the Chassidish said, the yeshivos are the mountains, the yeshivos are the deserts. The yeshivos is where you go to get away. Well, if you're in yeshiva, Baruch Hashem, you have that. When you're not in yeshiva full time, you have a real big struggle. So you have to create, in some ways, what has been called the ghetto of the mind. You have to recognize that this is not your environment. Now, again, I don't mean to say don't be friendly, don't be cooperative. I mean, work well with people, say good morning to people. I don't mean to be standoffish. But you also have to recognize their values are not my values. Their midos are not my midos. And maybe if God put me in this outpost, maybe part of my mission is to show that you can live by the Torah, even in this negative environment. But it's very, very hard. And that's why, b'dafka, when you're in the working world, you need to have a special connection with the Olam Shel Torah. In other words, you need the connection to the Torah world more than you needed it when you were in the yeshiva. And that would mean, for example, that your Shabbos and your Sundays, you do learning, you go to Beis Medrash, you have a Rav, a Rebbe that you talk to regularly, you make a special point of going to Minyan. In other words, you got to strengthen yourself because the environment that you're in is going to be so challenging. I mentioned before, I give commercials for good books. Many of you might have seen the book by Rav Aaron Lapiansky, the Rosh Yeshiva in Silver Spring, Maryland. It's called Ben Torah for Life, in which he says how to navigate the transition from full-time yeshiva or kollel avrech to the working world. And he says, how do you retain your spiritual identity while you're working in a secular environment? And I recommend that anyone that faces that situation, I recommend that book. Yeah.
So the consensus is that Mashiach is supposed to come by the year 6,000.
6,000, yeah.
But, so what is the basis for that claim? Where is it rooted in? And is there any uncertainty to it? Is the basis something that has a solid foundation, like in such a way where, if let's say it doesn't happen in the exact Hebrew year 6,000 based on the calendar, there's a way to explain around it?
Yeah. So the truth is, there is a source, but it's only one source, and it's a source of an individual rabbi. The individual rabbi says the world will exist for 6,000 years, and then the world as we know it will be destroyed, and the Messianic era will come in, and it corresponds to the idea that just as God made the world in 6 days, and after 6 days there was the Shabbos, so there'll be 6 millennia, followed by the Mashiach, which is called the eternal Shabbos. So there is a source, but it's interesting that the source is an individual das yachid, meaning it doesn't mean it's halachically the case. And when you look in the Rambam, in Hilchos Malachim, where the Rambam actually codifies the halachic principles of Mashiach, the Rambam does not bring the 6,000 year limit. And when the Rambam codifies in the 13 principles of faith that I as a Jew must believe in the coming of Mashiach, he does not say that he will come by the year 6,000. So, which means, in other words, it is generally accepted that Mashiach will come by the year 6,000, but that's not a fundamental tenet of Judaism. And therefore, if Mashiach doesn't come by the year 6,000, no chas v'shalom, that would not undermine our emunah in Bias Mashiach. It just means we made a mistake. But Mashiach will still come, no doubt about it. Yeah.
But so when the one rabbi says that he believes that it's because there's been 6,000 years of coal, is that just like a personal opinion, or like did he get that from somewhere?
So that's a good question. Where did he get it from? Was there an unbroken tradition? Was it his svara? Was it his logic? It's hard to know. My feeling is that it was a tradition, but it was not a universally agreed upon tradition. Which means its origin must have been somebody at some point had a svara, but that could have been much, much earlier than the rabbi who actually reported it. By the way, some of you, there was a very, very famous article written by the great Rav Shimon Schwab, Zichrono Livracha, who I had occasion to mention earlier in this week. One of the big historical conundrums in Jewish history is the missing 160 years. Let me explain what the issue is. I'm going to use some secular dates. According to our chronology, the first Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. There were 70 years of Babylonian exile. And then the second temple stood for 420 years. So 410, 70, 420, and the like. Now, here is the problem. we know that the first Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. Well, not that we know, but historians say, the first Beis Hamikdash was destroyed in the year 586 BCE. We also know that the second Beis Hamikdash was destroyed in the year 70 CE. So according to these two dates, the number of years from the Chorban Bayis Rishon to the Chorban Bayis Sheni is 586 plus 70. So what does that add up to? 586 plus 70 is 656 years. But we know, according to Jewish chronology, there was only 70 years between the destruction of the first temple and the building of the second temple, and then 420. So that gives you, instead of 656 years, you only have 490 years. So you're missing that difference. So Rav Schwab developed a fascinating article. I mean, the proofs are too complicated, that basically said the Chachamim concealed around 160 years in making the cheshbon shorter, which means instead of being in the year 5785, we are 160 or so years later. Right, so again, what does that add up to? 5785, let's say, plus 160, approximately 514. We're 5,949. In other words, we're a lot closer to the year 6000 than you might think. And Be'ezras Hashem, even if Mashiach doesn't come till the year 6000, hopefully, people alive today will be alive by then. Now, Rav Schwab, years later, withdrew the article. He says he's chozer. He says he doesn't have the right to say it, even though he has a lot of kashas on the conventional chronology. He says, Yehi munach at sheyavo Eliyahu Hanavi will have to clarify all of these things. But Lamaisa, this was his famous theory. He probably got a lot of flack for it. So he said, okay, I withdraw it, and the like. So it could be that you'll be zocheh to see if this 6,000 thing will pan out or not. Yeah.
You mentioned the proposition that father cannot teach his daughter Gemara.
Yeah, that's in the, yeah.
Can a mother teach her daughter?
Okay, that's a good question. But again, I believe that the overall context is that the parent should. Sometimes father means parent, not so much the male thing. Yeah, I would think. Yeah.
What is the role of Beged Isha today? Because now you have men wearing makeup for shaving arms, and on Purim, let's say if you want to dress up as a lady.
Yeah. So these are two different issues. All right. There's an issue in the Torah for a man to dress up as a woman and vice versa. So one question, which is totally independent of modern fashion, is what about Purim? One of the standard masquerades that people do on Purim. Sometimes little kids will, dress up in high heels and a dress, little boys, etc. And girls might do the opposite, dress like a Chassidish man or whatever it would be. And the question becomes, is that a prohibition of men or even children dressing like women, women dressing like men, right? Purim. So on that, the truth of the matter is there is a real reason to be machmer on it. It's not so pashut that it's mutter. But others say that Purim, the simcha of Purim, it's not being done to kind of represent yourself as unisex. It's being done in the simcha of the day and the like. But in terms of the general issue, where men are doing this, so the truth of the matter is, there actually is something a little bit strange about the prohibition of beged ish or beged isha. And that is, it actually does change with the times, meaning to say that when society adopts something that was formerly only done by women, and when it's widespread and done by men and women, it may very well be that according to halacha, a Jew would then be allowed to follow a prevailing societal trend. One good example, I'll give you a specific example, is removal of body hair. Remember that the prohibition of not dressing like a woman is not limited to clothing. It applies to any type of adornment of the body that was characteristic of women that men normally did not do. An example the Gemara gives is removal of pubic hair or any type of body hair, underarm hair, or the like. So in the Shulchan Aruch, we have this basic halacha that a man is not allowed to remove the hair unless there's a medical reason, or the like. But the truth is, I'm not giving you a psak on this, but the truth is, many poskim say that where it's a common practice, even among the goyim, that people remove some body hair from certain areas, so it would no longer be classified as a beged isha. Another example, which comes up sometimes, is can a man wear a wedding ring? Now, obviously, a Jewish marriage ceremony, the woman does not give the man a ring. That would invalidate the whole kedushin. But achar hamaisa, meaning they're married already, the wife would like her husband to wear a wedding ring. Is there anything wrong with wearing a wedding ring? Now, granted, I know it's not done in the yeshiva world, so I would not encourage people to do it. People might look at you strangely. That's a separate issue. But in times past, if it was uncommon for men to wear rings indicating their marriage status, that would be beged isha. As it becomes more and more common, it no longer is beged isha. Now, when do you reach the level of it being common enough is a difficult shaila, but there is a concept that the first guys who were doing it were over on beged isha, but then it became this pshat, and then at that point it might become mutter. Yeah.
Before you were talking about how there was like a certain amount of years that wasn't accounted for.
Yes. Yeah. 100. Yeah. Yeah.
Why are we so massive as historians in order to like say that we're lacking those years? Like why can it be that? It could be like the Torah tells us certain amount of years. Why is that? Oh, the Torah.
No, you're 100% correct. This is an issue. If you look at Rabbi Beryl Wine's history, he talks about this a little bit, and he says this is the most difficult problem in Jewish history to reconcile it. And some people say, 100% is right. Some people say, well, the secular date is just wrong, and the Churban Bayis Rishon was much later. Yeah. There are those Kaifrim who say Chazal are wrong, and the secular thing is right. And then there's other Mahalchim that try to reconcile. So Rav Schwab was trying to reconcile, because the truth is, there is a lot of evidence for it. It's not like a crazy thing. But you're right, there is a Mahalach that says we can just ignore it. We don't have to care about the accuracy of the secular calendar. Yeah.
A lot of times, like in history, I know in regards to like the whole Earth theory about being like billions of years old, whatever, a lot of times people have like come to say that Rabbanim have changed that it's not really billions, just that we had it counted years back then was like at a different scale. Like I've heard that before.
Yeah,
and
okay.
Like a difference in, it could be they're both, could necessarily be
Okay,
right.
that might be an approach too, about the definition of a year. How do you count a year? Yeah. Although I think it's a little more dochek. See, it's one thing to do that at the creation of the world. It's a little more dochek to give a new definition of a year when you're talking about there's already human societies. I think there's an afkamina in using the svara in Brias HaOlam versus using the svara when there's a human culture that's around. Yeah.
Did you want to go? Oh, I was wondering, during the Second Temple period, a lot of the Bible, as we know it today, was codified. When did the codification start? When did they end? And how did they choose what made the cut? What became apocrypha?
Yeah, the issue of not codified is canonization is the term that they use. Yeah, canonized. Yeah. So the activity of canonization started by the Anshe Knesset Hagdola at the very beginning of the Second Temple period, because that was the conclusion of prophecy. Prophecy stopped, and then they decided to look at the different books that are circulating and which books are considered to be prophetic, inspired, and which books were not. And the Anshe Knesset Hagdola, which really was Ezra, Nehemiah, who had their own books in there, they were involved in the canonization process. But the truth of the matter is, it's very clear from the Mishnah that the canonization was not totally finished until the times of Rabbi Akiva. Now, Rabbi Akiva is really, really late. Rabbi Akiva is after the Bar Kochba, or during the Bar Kochba. I mean, that's 100. Let's see, the Bar Kochba is at 130. So this is 60 years after the Churban Beis Hamikdash. The Anshe Knesset Hagdola at the beginning of the Second Temple period. This is almost 500 years later, and there were machloksim about books that we consider very holy. Shir Hashirim. Some said, Shir Hashirim is secular love songs. We don't consider it holy. And Rabbi Akiva was the one who convinced them that it's a metaphor and the like. So the canonization process lasted, at least for some controversial cases, 500 years. Now, I assume that these were machloksim only on marginal cases. Now, the Shir Hashirim was a good example. I'm assuming that the vast majority was nichlal in Tanach right away. The 5 books of Torah, of course, were right away. There was no machlokas about that. What were the exact criteria? I don't know. I mean, obviously, in order to be a book of Nevi'im, it has to be determined that the author of the book is a bona fide Navi. In order to be the Ksuvim, it has to be determined that the book was a product of Ruach HaKodesh. How do they know that in retrospect if the person is not even alive when they're canonizing the book? I'm not sure, but this was considered to be the Chachma of Torah Shebal Peh, in which this was an issue that they looked at, the canonization. And a lot of books didn't make the cut, right? For example, the Apocrypha, Sfarim Chitzonim, as we call it. The book of the Maccabees, which is the whole Hanukkah story, is not in Tanakh, right? It was not considered to be a book of Ruach HaKodesh. That doesn't mean it's not accurate. That doesn't mean it's not a good book of history. Rashi considers it to be a valid book of history, but it's not Kodesh in that way. Yeah. Yeah.
On the subject of the Megillah, what part of that is divinely inspired? Running through my head, I can't remember what part of it.
Well, the Gemara in Megillah actually gives many proofs. It gives like 10 different indicators of divine inspiration, especially the psukim in which we're told what different people thought at different times. And how would you know what they thought unless there was Ruach HaKodesh? So the Gemara in Megillah talks about Esther Beruach HaKodesh, Nemra, and it goes through a few proofs about that. Okay, last question. Yeah.
Mishnah in being of Chelek says everyone has a Chelek in HaRav.
Yeah.
Anyone does these things,
So you're asking.
What's the significance of these other
Right. So you're asking the question: if everybody every Jew has a chelek in Olam HaBo, then why do I need the muftach lo? If I do certain things, I'm guaranteed. So I think that might be the answer, because if you read the Mishnah says everybody has a chelek in Olam HaBo, but then it says, and the following people don't, meaning you're born with a chelek, but you could lose it by Averis. So I think the muftach is not a guarantee that you can't do Averis, but I think it means it'll give you shemira, that you won't come to the Averis that will take away your chelek. So I think there's a difference between having a chelek and having a muftach chelek, in which God will protect you in the zechus of these particular mitzvahs, that you won't be mafsid your chelek in Olam HaBo. Yeah.
I heard someone proclaim that the whole Torah is about being a good person. So what does Rabbi think about that, and also how would it fit with I don't remember who he said the Torah on one foot is you have to.
Oh, that's the Hillel. Yeah. Yeah, the whole Torah is about being a good person. Well, it depends how you define it. If a good person means someone who keeps the whole Torah, then I would agree, right? The purpose of the Torah is that we keep the Torah, which means be a good person. In other words, that's a tautology, as they say. But okay. So let's take that story of Hillel. That's a good story. Remember, the non-Jew who wanted to convert came to Shammai first and said, "Teach me the whole Torah on one foot." Shammai thought the guy was making fun of him. Shammai kicked him out. He then goes to Hillel, and Hillel says, "Well, I'll tell you, I'll teach you the whole Torah while you stand on one foot." And he says, "Madasani lach," what you would hate people doing to you. You wouldn't want people to do things bad to you. Do not do to your friends. V'idach. And the rest of the Torah, Zil Gemara, go and learn. So the question is very obvious. The Torah is comprised of both mitzvahs between man and God, bein adam l'makam, and bein adam l'chaverei. Now, at most, Hillel only gave a formula for 50% of the Torah. Don't hurt other people. You don't want to be embarrassed. You don't want to be disregarded. You don't want to be disrespected. Don't do it to other people. So we could say that's a summary of Bein Adam L'Chaverei. But how does it pick up tefillin, kosher, Shabbos? The guy said, "Teach me the whole Torah on one foot." So Rashi gives a beautiful answer. Rashi says, when Hillel says, "Don't hurt your friend does not only include your fellow human being. Hashem is your friend. Hashem is also your friend. So he's Avinu, he's our father, he's Malkeinu. He's also our friend. You wouldn't want people to disregard you. You wouldn't want people to treat you with disrespect. Don't treat Hashem with disrespect." So according to that, it's not only the Bein Adam L'Chaverei, it's Bein Adam L'Makam. Now, the Rambam does suggest in the Moreh Nevuchim that on some level, all of the mitzvahs of the Torah are designed to improve our midos. Now, it's hard for us to know that all the time. We don't always know how a Bein Adam L'Makam improves our midos tovos. But part of it is the discipline of not doing what you want is also a character builder. Some of you might, when you were children, I don't know if you ever did martial arts like taekwondo. So I remember when my son was in third or fourth grade, so he was doing taekwondo, and it was actually in the school itself, the Jewish school. And I hate to say it, but sometimes the lessons that he learned in taekwondo were, better than the lessons he was learning in the Torah shir, because it taught discipline, it taught derech eretz, it taught respect. You have to, you don't just beat people up, but there's a certain dignity to it, teamwork. So discipline itself has a certain function. The idea that I can't eat anything I want to eat. I can't do whatever I want to do. That improves your midos too, because it shows you're not an animal. So there is a mahalach that all of the mitzvahs are ultimately about tikkun hamidos, even the Bein Adam L'Makam. Okay, thank you, and be off. Take care.
Thank you for listening and for watching our Ohr Somayach Podcast Network content. Baruch Hashem, we have had tens of thousands of people weekly who are engaging with our Torah content via all of the different mediums and channels that we have. But we can't do it alone. We need your help. Help support Ohr Somayach's mission of spreading Torah across the globe. Click the description. Help in whatever way you can. Whatever you can do to help matters. You matter. Thank you for spreading Jewish education worldwide.
Thank you for listening to this Ohr Somayach production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.